So today I'd like to welcome Gavin Broad, who's going to talk to us about Ichneumonid wasps. As I mentioned earlier, I've had the pleasure of sitting one of Gavin's courses and it was absolutely fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to what Gavin's going to tell us about wasps and their taxonomy. And it's great to have an active member of the British Entomological and Natural History Society delivering a talk in their research subject. So Gavin, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Kieran. That's a real pleasure to be able to talk about. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk about wasps. And this is, so here's one of my beautiful wasps. I'm lucky enough to work at the Natural History Museum in London. So I am a curator of Ichneumonid wasps, plus a whole bunch of other groups. But my research interests are in Ichneumonids, and I'm going to introduce a little bit about Ichneumonids and some of the particular bits of research that I'm doing at the moment. So there is a world of wasps, there really is. So I could have talked about all sorts of topics, but I am going to talk about nocturnal wasps, such as this. This is a beautiful Ophion obscuratus there. Nocturnal, fly at night, come to light traps. Anybody can find these things. There's lots and lots of species, and I'm going to hopefully get across a little bit about why nocturnal Ichneumonid wasps are worth studying and what a sort of rich research area it is. But Ichneumonids, what are they? They're often called Darwin wasps nowadays. I was actually involved in that paper where we proposed the name Darwin wasps. I don't take any credit for that myself, but the name Darwin was proposed as a sort of common vernacular name for this group, basically because Darwin rather famously explained how, or expressed his abhorrence at their lifestyle and how, surely a beneficent God couldn't allow these things to exist, eating caterpillars from the inside. But there you go, that's what they do. They go around eating caterpillars from the inside, but also doing a lot of other things. Here's a couple of examples here of Ichneumonid wasps, which are, I suppose, what people often think about, and the first way that people find Ichneumonid wasps, certainly the way I got into them, you find a caterpillar, rear it through to a pupa, and then lo and behold, you don't get a moth or a butterfly. Instead, a wasp pops out. So at least on my right there's a lovely black wasp called Trogus lapidator, which has emerged from a swallowtail pupa. Exactly what butterfly enthusiasts don't want to see, but exactly what I do want to see. They're fascinating things. There's the other little wasp is from the same subfamily. It's called Listrodromus nycthomerus, and this is, again, one of these sort of famous Ichneumoniid, well, as famous as Ichneumoniid wasps go, as in this is well known as a parasitoid of the holly blue butterfly. And it has a lovely sort of pattern of increases in numbers, and then the holly blue crashes because loads of them get attacked by this wasp. Then the wasp population crashes, holly blue increases, the wasp increases. So there's sort of the population cycles that sort of track each other over time. And that's a great example of sort of how the effects that these things can have on their hosts, on ecosystems out there. They attack a lot of different host insects, eating them, and probably incredibly important in regulating populations of hosts. And probably a lot of you know that. But Ichneumonids themselves, the Darwin wasps, I live in Britain. It's not the best place in the world for many groups of insects, but for Ichneumonids or Darwin wasps, this is a great place. I mean, we've got 2,500 species just known from Britain. If that's 10% of our sort of insect fauna are these little wasps, or sometimes quite big wasps, flying around, attacking other insects, laying eggs on or in them. Here's a selection of these beautiful little things. In Japanese, they're called himabati wasps. Himabati is sort of princess wasps, which I think is a great name. Some of these things are very elegant. You got just an example here, just on this little screen here, you got some of my favorites. You've got Euceros with its mad antennae, which lays eggs on vegetation, and then its larvae hyperparasitize other wasps. And you've got Agriotypus with its dark wings that crawls into the water and attacks caddisfly pupae. A beautiful agrippon, which fly around the vegetation looking like little fairies. So, they come in all shapes and sizes, and there's an awful lot of the diversity. So up here in the north temperate regions of the world, they're an incredibly diverse group. So everybody should get into Ichneumoniid wasps, clearly. but I'm going to concentrate on nocturnal wasps. This is a paper. So this is a paper I wrote with my good colleague, Mark Shaw. I work a lot with Mark, who's like a guru of wasp biology and taxonomy. Lives in Edinburgh. Mark and I, back in 2016, which suddenly seems like the distant past, we wrote this little paper on these nocturnal wasps called Enicospilus. Now, there's only a few species in Britain, but I had an aim that if we sort of basically sort out the taxonomy of these nocturnal wasps, sort out the taxonomy, make them accessible to people through user-friendly identification keys, summarize their distribution and their flight times, and then hopefully we'll start to be able to monitor where these wasps are found, how their populations might be changing over time. Because nobody has any real idea of how parasitoid wasp populations and distributions change, in this world of massive sort of changes to land use, to climate, these things at the top of the food chain, the apex predators. How are they doing? So we started with quite a small genus, Enicospilus. Like I said, there's only about, gosh, I can't even remember. There's about 9 species in Britain, something like that. Taxonomy was really crazy, actually. We had to sort out some mess. But in the end, we did it. We did this little paper, published distribution maps, which essentially show you not exactly their true distribution, but where people have been collecting them, which is quite a different thing. And when they fly at different times of the year, so that's great. We summarized what we know about their hosts, and that's prompted a few people to sort of work on these wasps. So basically what we've tried to do, so I thought, right, we'll go on to the next group, and that step has been quite long. That was 8 years ago, and I'm still on the next step of looking at the other nocturnal parasitoid wasps. So I'll sort of show you about where I'm getting with a different genus called Netelia. But one of the great results, so what we want to do with these sorts of papers is open up larger faunas. So this is on the left there. These are just screenshots of papers, obviously, and I think you'll get links to some of these. Review of the Swedish species of Ophion. That was the next genus I was going to tackle after Enicospilus, but my friend Nicholas Johansson in Sweden really got into this group. And this is just a great illustration. This is Ophion, like Enicospilus, but a little bit different in wing venation. There are more species. We thought we knew most of the species. Then he said, he described 18 new species from Sweden. That's good. And I've found quite a few of those now in Britain. So very quickly, we've had a huge change in our knowledge of the species richness of this group. I want to get there. I want to be able to get there with more genera of Ichneumonids to the point where we actually have a good idea of what the species are and how to identify them, which for a group like Ichneumonids is surprisingly difficult. We're about where coleopterists were about 200 years ago, probably, in terms of understanding our fauna. And then we want to use that to actually look at change, like I said. So the other paper I've just highlighted there, some lovely paper with Galina Jonsson, who was a master's student and then went on to do a PhD, partly at the museum. And she used museum collections to look at how wasp population, well, particularly the hornet, Vespa crabra, how distribution has changed over a century in the UK. And that's amazing that we can start to use this sort of data that lies in collections to look at how species are doing over quite long periods of time. But to get there, you need to know what are the species we're looking at and how are they related. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk quite a bit about taxonomy, the sort of nuts and bolts of how I go about working out what species are here, how they're related, and then interpreting what they're doing. I also want to point out that, as you may have noticed, this is quite a long and circuitous journey, and sometimes it seems like there's no end in sight, but there is an end in sight. Like I say, it's been 8 years since my last paper on nocturnal wasps, so it's about time I got to move on. So yes, but actually this is even longer than 2016. Way back in 2004, this is just how I got to be where. This is why I'm talking about nocturnal wasps today. Way back in 2004, I started sorting through these wasp samples. So if you stick up a light, you often get these nocturnal wasps, orangey, pale orangey things, quite a variety of species come to light very readily. And I had a contact at Rothamsted who was working through all the samples from the Rothamsted Light Trap survey, and he really, and amazingly, Phil Gould, for a year, took all the wasps out and sent them to me, which is an amazing source of specimens. And then I started pinning these and identifying them, and then realizing just what a mess it was trying to identify some of these things. So naively, I thought, we'll build up a data set and start to look at change. Instead, 20 years later, we're getting to that situation, getting to the position now where we can start to look at change, which I'll come to in a bit. Oh, this is probably out of sequence, but anyway, Netelia. If we go back, sorry. So Netelia, just to say, this genus that I'm looking at here, this is the abstract for the paper that I might actually finally submit in the next couple of months. Just to work out what species. Netelia are one of these nocturnal groups. Let's go back to that picture. A lot of those little gangly wasps with long antennae and long legs, a lot of those are Netelia. They look very similar to those Ophion and Enicospilus that I mentioned. Nocturnal wasps, plenty of species. As you can see, with all these, hopefully this will make a bit more sense as we go through the talk. All these bits in bold, SPERT-NOV, SYN-NOV, STAT-REV. These are all the taxonomic changes I'm having to make just to know what species are in the UK. So we'll come on to that in a bit. This hopefully will be submitted soon. What are Netelia? Netelia are gorgeous little or quite large wasps sometimes that fly at night. And just to compare with the genus that is slightly better known, Ophion, they're very different subfamilies of Ichneumonids, but they look kind of similar because they do much the same thing. They fly at night looking for caterpillars. So they've sort of converged in the same appearance. They're usually pale orangey, plus or minus creamy or yellowy marks. This Ophion here has a very distinctive wing venation. It's got this big, what I call horsehead cell. Netelia, the cell doesn't extend as far, and it usually has a nice little narrow cell called the areolette. And then Ophion have quite a different sort of way of moving their abdomens around. So that first metasomal segment, the base of what looks like the base of the abdomen, is a long, narrow tube, and the spiracles towards the back. Flipped on the Netelia, it's not a fused tube. You've actually got a big gap at you've got a big sort of pit at the base called the glimmer, the spiracles there. So the function, structurally, they're actually very different wasps when you look in detail, but superficially they look very similar. And the reason they are functionally, structurally quite different is they're doing kind of different things when they're actually finding caterpillars. So those Ophion wasps and their relatives are laying an egg inside a caterpillar. You don't generally see it until the wasp has finished feeding, and then it bursts out of the fully fed caterpillar and pupates. Netelia are doing something different. They are laying an egg on the active caterpillar, usually as it's crawling around trying to look for a pupation site. These are a couple of photos I've taken of parasitized caterpillars. You can see this nice noctuid I've totally forgotten what this caterpillar is. It's got black spots where the Netelia has stung it, or at least jabbed the ovipositor in, and their little larvae have hatched. So they're hanging on the outside. The one I do know, the one in the soil, is shoulder-striped wainscot. It's got, you can see two larvae. There are actually three on it. And these are Netelia. They've started to feed. Shoulder-striped wainscot caterpillar has burrowed into the soil. It's starting to form a pupation chamber, and that's the cue for the wasps to hatch. These eggs, by the way, are just anchored into the cuticle of the host. It's quite an amazing process. The egg comes down the outside of the ovipositor of the wasp. It's got a little anchor at the end, which is shoved into the caterpillar, so they can't remove it. Like I say, when the humidity is just right in the pupation chamber, then the egg hatches, the wasp larvae start feeding, and then the caterpillar is pretty doomed from that point on. And these often solitary, but as in these cases here, some of these Netelia get gregarious, or they can change their behavior. They can be solitary or gregarious depending on the size of the host. So these are some lovely photos from Mark Shaw. He took these years ago. He got puss moth Cerura vinula in culture. Beautiful caterpillar. here's Netelia vinuli, which is specialized for attacking this wasp, this caterpillar. You can see it there. It jabs the caterpillar with its ovipositor, delivers a temporarily paralyzing venom. It then has, in this case, it's had a little host. So the bottom left for me, hopefully the bottom left for you, that's the Netelia wasp actually drinking a little bit of the caterpillar's hemolymph, its blood. It needs a bit of energy, it needs a bit of protein to sort of mature those eggs. And you can just see the caterpillar with some black eggs on a sort of intersegmental membrane. The caterpillar, obviously puss moth, forms a really hard cocoon with some chewed up sort of bark. And here's one sliced open, and there are all the Netelia cocoons all packed inside the host cocoon. So that's a great illustration of a gregarious Netelia species, and one that seems to be absolutely specifically attacking one host. Usually they have slightly broader host ranges than that. Very cool wasps. Another really nice thing about them is, compared to many Ichneumonid wasps, we don't tend to get obsessed with male genitalia, which, you know, dipterists and lepidopterists often do. But in Netelia, they have some really cool structures going on in their genitalia for some reason. They've got this big thing called the pad. We don't know what it is, so we just call it the pad because it looks a bit membranous, and they are often species specific. And there's a brace, again, which seems to lift the pad. But anyway, there's some cool structures in there, so you can often identify species in Netelia by their genitalia, which is a bit of a rarity for Ichneumonid. Why they have more complex genitalia than most Ichneumonid, I don't know. Here's a pair mating, which I took a fairly poor photo of with my phone, but you can just about see at the back end. I think the male, his genital capsule is basically a rat sort of clasping onto the female hypopygium, the last abdominal at the bottom, the lower side of the abdomen towards the end. And I think these pads are sort of holding on and sort of pulling down this hypopygium at the end, but you have to study those better. This was totally chance occurrence. You don't usually see them mating because they probably do it at night. In this case, I'd knocked them out with CO2 to check their identification, and then they got a bit, well, the male got a bit frisky when they came to. But anyway, would love to know what they're doing. And like most aspects of wasps, I would love to know what they're doing. I also would love to know what they all are. This was a sort of typical draw in the Natural History Museum of Netelia from back when I started this project. I love this draw because it looks really ordered, you know, things in nice series and some notes there which says NB, probably a mixed series, opacula, detmorn, you know, it looks kind of organized, but everything in here was misidentified. I think there were 2 specimens that were actually under the correct name, and that was pure chance. So sorting this out, if you're a taxonomist like me, is quite fun, but also quite daunting because you've got sort of decades or even centuries of previous work to unpick. So it's getting from that draw of chaos to a situation where I know how to identify species. Hopefully, many other people can then learn how to identify these things and then actually record them in the wild and do all the other sort of cool ecology, which I'll mention briefly. Where to start? So this is a sort of like quick, I'll do a quick and very selective tour through bits of working out what names to give to wasps, the nuts and bolts of taxonomy. This is a great paper from 1975 by Gavino del Rio. He worked on the European Netelia and was the first person to produce usable keys in French. And luckily, I have my GCSE French, so that helped. But back in 1975, the quality of illustrations was not brilliant. His photos of genitalia are almost unusable, but he actually did a good job. And I often refer to his work here for identifying, but it's clearly, as I'll come on to, it's not the end. I don't think he would have ever claimed it was the definitive word in Netelia taxonomy, but it's a fantastic start. So I had that, and that helped me trying to identify all these Netelia, particularly the many hundreds and then thousands of unidentified Netelia that I was amassing. So I found it really useful. I love this key. I love this quote. So this is a bit random. I just love this little acerbic comment from Jacques Aubert. Aubert was actually Del Rio's PhD supervisor. But about 7 years later, in 1982, he rather cuttingly says that Netelia ornata cannot be identified using Del Rio. It does not allow you to arrive at the correct species identity. This is true of many of Del Rio's keys. That's really not very fair. And I think this is a great example of, Aubert was a good taxonomist in many ways, but I think he mixed his species up. And his efforts have just served to actually muddy the waters further. This is the species he was complaining about, Netelia ornata. I have a few specimens in the museum. It is actually, this is a beautiful little wasp. Sometimes really striking pale markings. It's a bit dull on this specimen here, but the back, this is the back of the thorax. That's the propodium. In the middle there, that's a scanning electron micrograph. The propodium, for those, if you've not come across that, in Hymenoptera, that's the first abdominal segment. And in many Hymenoptera, or the non-sawflies, this first abdominal segment is fused to the thorax. So the propodium looks like it's the back of the thorax, but it's actually the first abdominal segment. And the constriction there, where it looks like the abdomen is articulating, that's between the first and second abdominal segments. Anyway, Netelia ornata is a great, you can see that big ridge that curves up. That's really distinctive, the form and shape of that ridge. There's really no mistaking ornata, and yet everybody has mistaken it. So partly because of people like Aubert. There's its genitalia, actually remarkably boring for a Netelia species. So how do you go about? I thought I knew what Netelia ornata was because I keyed it out using Del Rio in his 1975 paper. But what if you've only got the original description? And it was described by Snellen van Vollenhoven in 1873 in Dutch, described it as Peniscus ornatus. So I should point out at this point, I thank you, Biodiversity Heritage Library. What an amazing resource for old literature, sometimes new literature. But so now to find all these original descriptions of obscure wasps or anything else that you're interested in, used to be many trips to the library. Now, so much of this literature is available free online. It's an amazing initiative. There you go. Back in 1873, Vollenhoven described Peniscus ornatus in a few sentences and almost entirely concentrating on the color pattern. Not actually very helpful because loads of Netelia have the same color pattern. So there you go. He actually, at some point, and again, thank you, Google Translate. Google Translate, it's a huge help. A lot of the literature I deal with for original descriptions is German, Russian, languages that I do not know at all. Anyway, at some point, I think Vollenhoven points out in Dutch that abdomen, it's basically doesn't look much like any other species. It doesn't look any different to other species. There's nothing special about the abdomen or the propodium, which is completely wrong because it does have a really special propodium. You wouldn't know that from the original description. But there you go. There's Del Rio. There's his exciting. He's describing how it's got a transverse carina, which is really strong, and it's curved, so it must be ornatus. And then I see, ornata is one valid species. So this is a catalogue of Netelia, and this is just going on about some of the difficulties you face in. I just want to get across that all these names exist, and what they actually refer to is a different thing. The names exist, they're regulated through taxonomic codes, but the actual species concept is another thing. And I'm trying to attach these names to the correct species concept. Here we've got, according to the latest catalogue, there's 3 different names, which are all treated as 3 separate species: Netelia decorator, Longipes, and ornata. I think they're all the same species, but all the information is scattered between these 3 different names in the literature. So there, we saw Vollenhoven's really unhelpful description, but here's the actual type specimen in in Holland, in fact, Naturalis in Leiden. Good. I mean, that's exactly what I hoped it would be. It's the same species that I've been calling Netelia ornata. Very cool. The specimen is lacking an abdomen. It's got an abdomen glued onto a piece of card. Unhelpfully, that's from an entirely different species of Netelia. But the type specimen's dirty, of course, but we can see what it is. That's great. So I think I've sorted that. We go on. Why are some people calling Netelia decorator a different name? Here it is. Here's the type specimen. It looks a bit more colourful, but actually the colour pattern is the same as ornata. And in fact, the propodium has exactly the same structure as Netelia ornata. This is the same species. It's just a synonym. So that's handy. On the other, I don't know why other people have been treating it as a separate species. So I think I've sorted out Netelia ornata, and then I find there's a population. I found some specimens from Mallorca on my left there with much narrower back of the head, much paler markings. I think that's a separate species. So having said that, I can easily recognize Netelia ornata. I actually have a second species that looks almost exactly the same, but is structurally a little bit different. So then I need to find out, does that have a name? Do I need to describe this, or does it already have a name? I really hope it already has a name, because that makes my life easier. And then it's going through the Russian literature. Sorry, essentially, this is the bit which really bogs down a lot of this sort of work. It's trying to work out why people have treated different names as synonyms or as valid species. Here we've got a whole bunch of names which are treated as synonyms of Netelia longipes. There's a helpful description of this, which of course we now know is a synonym of Netelia ornata. It's the same species. The illustration of the genitalia looks nothing like this species, so presumably Tolkienitz has confused these things entirely. She's put all these three names in synonymy. This is something else entirely. So now I have to make sure. So these have to be taken out of synonymy and become a valid. This guy called Kokuzhev was really busy in 1915 describing species from east of China. There you go. There's three species he described. Those are the type specimens. They're all the same species. Henry Towns sorted that out in 1965. So why people keep changing it ever since, I have no idea. So I've got to put those, got to change back to what Henry Towns said. So there you go. We've done that. So that's taken up a month of my time sorting out those names so I can know what Netelia ornata is. Here's another one that came along. It's a similar species. I was going to describe this as new from Britain. It's very exciting. It's slightly different from Netelia ornata. I thought that's a cool new species. Then I discovered, oh, actually, it was described from Canada. These are the genitalia, a specimen from Yorkshire and a specimen from Canada, allowing for the slightly different perspective. They're the same. They've got a distinctive sort of bit of striate sculpture inside the genitalia. They've got a sort of triangular bit that sticks out. Really nice. I was very chuffed to find that it was already had a name, and it was known now from both North America and from Northern Europe. But of course, everybody, oh yeah, so sorted that one out. It's another group. Everybody had been calling this species Netelia thompsonii. This common thing down the bottom there is actually called Netelia inedita. This is something that's quite common in Britain. And so all the literature, it's under the wrong name. So I've had to sort out. So again, this is just some pictures I'm including in this paper I'm working on. At the top is the true Netelia thompsonii, which for all you, very discerning Netelia enthusiasts, you'll notice that the top of the thorax is quite shiny. It's a bit glossier and the yellow markings stand out a bit more. Netelia inedita, it's a bit duller sculpture and the yellow markings are really subtle. They're actually really easy to tell apart, but they've been confused forever. Everything's been called Netelia thompsonii. It's not. And again, it's not just semantics. Why does this matter? Because actually they're doing quite different things. The true Netelia thompsonii is out there attacking pug moths. It's been reared from large pug, Eupithecia lyriciata in Switzerland and other places. Whereas Netelia inedita is is attacking quite different geometrid moths, particularly the garden carpet, Xanthorrhoea fluctuata. So they've got entirely different hosts. So they're doing quite different things. So the fact that the names have been completely confused has not been helpful for understanding how host specific these species are. When they were sort of lumped together, you'd imagine that this species is attacking all sorts of geometrid moths, but actually these more narrowly defined species have very particular host ranges. There you go. So this is I always go to these seminars about insect evolution or whatever, and there's always a slide where they show a phylogenetic tree of the group they're working on. They always say, but of course you can't see any details. That's exactly the case here. Of course you can't see any details. So why have I put it up? I will zoom in on bits. So part of what I've been doing to sort out the taxonomy of these Netelia wasps is to get DNA sequence data and reconstruct the phylogeny of this group in Europe. I mean, at the moment, we don't have anything like all the species sequenced, partly because of a lack of fresh material, but we're getting there, and we already have a fairly good phylogeny, which can tell us a lot of interesting things about Netelia, how they're related, and how host use changes across the tree. So if you can imagine, this is all this branching pattern here, the tree of Netelia. Down the base of the tree, the earliest branches to split off. These are all classified in a bunch of different subgenera. Things like Parapheltes, Besibates, Prosthodocus. So if you imagine down, all these Netelia back in the day, many millions of years ago, were diversifying, and this is where most of the structural variation is. Bits of the bodies look quite different for these different subgenera. And we can also see that these different subgenera are not necessarily monophyletic. So things we classify as Parapheltes are actually quite distantly related to each other. So there's going to have to be some big changes to the way we classify these. And interestingly, some things which look very similar, like Besibates, may not be each other's closest relatives. We'll come on to that. Also, but for me, one of the really interesting features of this little tree is the fact that down the base here, all these early branches of Netelia, or almost all these branches, are attacking geometrid moths, looper moths. So the family Geometridae. And that's a pattern. So they're going for different groups of geometrids, and some of them jumped onto Drepanidae, but that's the same superfamily. But then you go further up the tree, and this is the subgenus Netelia. So Netelia, and these are monophyletic. All the Netelia are each other's closest relatives. And here you see a host switch. So it's like this group, there's more species in this subgenus Netelia, and they've done really well by switching onto noctuid moths. So the family Noctuidae is obviously a big species-rich group of caterpillars, of Lepidoptera, and Netelia have done really well on this. But one species group seems to have jumped onto Notodontidae. So you can see a very conserved pattern here. And this is, you can only really you can start to make predictions then, or I hope to make predictions, that some of these species that we don't know the hosts of, almost certainly. So here between the yellow and pink, there's a couple of undescribed species from Britain, which I might come on to in a minute. And I predict that these are probably going to be attacking, not surprisingly, noctuid moths, although they are very closely related to a noted group of notodontid specialists. Oh yeah, there's my undescribed species from England. And you can also see on this phylogenetic tree, you see the actual individual branches leading to each group and to each specimen are really short. These things are very rapidly diversified. There's hardly any difference in this particular gene, cytochrome oxidase 1. There's hardly any difference between species in this group. As the sort of older subgenera on the right there, long branches, you can see these things have been diverging for a long time. So I think that these wasps are quite actively speciating at the moment. And when we go through all the European fauna, we may find quite a lot of very restricted range species. So at the moment, I've got these 2 undescribed species from England, and in fact, I've only seen specimens from England, which I'm sure that can't just be found here. But anyway, this is one of them. I've mentioned this. This is one I've recognized as undescribed for quite a while, so I really better describe it in the next few months. This is what I found originally in my front garden. I'm calling it Netelia williamsi. Again, it is subtly different from some other closely related species. Only known at the moment from a sort of basically it's centered around the Chilterns, but also extends a bit east and west of there. Really restricted range, quite weird. I would love to know what its host is. These are some closely related species, and I've outlined the pad in purple just to show that even though externally they look very different, there are some lovely differences in their male genital capsules. So there you go, and you can see the species in inverted commas are not published yet. They're on the way. So there you go, and getting somewhere. There's another undescribed species. And then you can see a relative with completely different genitalia, and handily on the tree, it comes out in a completely different place. That's good. But I've got the first host records for some of these species. Netelia opacula there. Apparently, I've seen a brood of them reared from the red underwing moths. That was really cool. Nobody knew what that was doing before. And then starting to look at their anatomy, we've got here the claws of some of these species. And we know that Netelia testacea is attacking kitten moths, their caterpillars, and it's got lovely dense claws, which the males do anyway. Lovely dense claws, which are curved pectination. I don't know why they need these special claws. These noctuid parasitoids have much less curved claws, and you start to look in great detail, and they're obviously doing something different with these claws. So just, although they look much the same, when you look in great detail at bits of them, you can start to see some structural variation, which probably says a lot about their life history. Anyway, that's got some, just to get into, if you do get into Netelia, which I'm sure everybody will, identifying them can be a bit of a nightmare. I am trying to produce user-friendly keys, but sometimes it's down to what look like really tiny superficial differences, like whether that little cross vein in the wing is straight or has a little kink, how high this vein is intercepted compared to there. So there you go. There's the sort of things where they can give you a great clue as to what the wasp is, but you really need to get your eye in. And this is the scutellum at the back of the thorax. Again, I've been trying to, these things are horrible to photograph, by the way, this pale orangey cuticle. I'm not very good at it, but you can see the strength of these ridges, these carinae at the edge of the scutellum. They vary between different species. So hopefully with actually publishing some really nice photos, I should be able to make these a bit easier for other people to identify. I had to put a shot of faces in. My colleague Nicholas says all wasps have characteristics. Each species of wasp pretty much has a characteristic face. I don't know, maybe you can imagine them as a bit more severe and a bit more sort of depressed, these faces. It works for Nicholas anyway. There's some differences in propodium sculpture. But yeah, there you go. But what we're doing with this, once we know what the species are and how to identify them, we can start going through the collections and re-identifying specimens. And this is just a quick chart I put together. These are species of Netelia in the same subgenus. There's 4 species. 2 of them down here, so that's Latungula and Palescens, are quite host specialist. They've got very narrow host range. And you can see, sorry, this is quite confusing. These are different decades going back to the late 1880s and how many specimens there are in the Natural History Museum collections. So obviously, as we get towards the present day, the collections have grown a lot since the 1970s in particular, but you would expect if all species of this group were equally common, they would continue to be equally well represented in the collection. In fact, what happens is at least what I found for this group, the 2 species which have a lot of known hosts, Netelia cristata and Netelia variegata, they seem to attack a variety of caterpillars. They have indeed, we've got many more specimens now in the last few decades. And so they're comparatively much better represented. Whereas the host specialist ones, we're still collecting at about the same, still adding to the collection at about the same rate as we did in previous decades. So I think this disparity is an indication that the host specialist species are declining. And I hope to start addressing that using molecular means, which I'll come on to in a minute. And yeah, this is, and again, these terribly obscure wasps, we now actually have online recording for some of these. So we've got, iRecord has been really good for some of these species because some of them are really easy to identify from photos alone. I've got a shot, that photo there is Netelia miliarati. In collections in the UK, there's a handful of specimens from before the 2000s, literally 3 specimens. Then since the 2000s, there were a trickle, and now suddenly, in the last 4 years, I've got loads of records, mainly through iRecord. So compare that to Netelia inedita, which has always been probably a common and widespread species in the UK. It looks quite similar to miliarati. And you can see the trends there over the decades. Basically, increasing recording leads to increasing numbers and a quite steady increase. This very sharp increase suggests to me this is real. This is Netelia miliarati arriving in the UK properly and really getting established. So that's really cool to see that. The other thing that we're doing, I'm very much involved in Darwin Tree of Life. This is a project which has been going for about 5 years now, coming to the end of its pilot phase, collecting species of all kinds of organism to sequence their entire genomes. These are 2 genome papers that we've published for 2 species of Netelia. So we now know, for these 2 species at least, Netelia virgata and Netelia fuscicornis, how their genome is structured into chromosomes, and can find out where all the genes are in there. And I hope that we can use this sort of information to start going back to the old specimens in the collections, sequencing genes and working out how their populations have changed over the last century genetically, what kind of genetic bottlenecks or indeed expansions have they gone through. So that's a really cool resource, which is only now becoming available. We've got a bunch more Netelia genomes coming out, so I hope to get some students working on those. And that's probably a good opportunity to close. I would like to thank, obviously, all the light trappers and lepidopterists who've given the many specimens. Mark Shaw, who has been a constant encouragement. Iona Cunningham-Urick is doing her PhD with me, and Iona's doing some great work on distribution changes in Netelia and Ophion. So watch this space, and she publishes that. And all the people who've been helping me to sequence. So yeah, thank you very much.